This is Christian Science, and the only book I have never read it, and admittedly I didn't really I think leafed through it, so I didn't read too much of it. But if this really interests you, I have a book here that was, I think it's published around the turn of the century, 1907. I think was the original publication of it, maybe. But this is sort of the history of Christian Science, which my overall. So this is going to be a new one for most. Oh, here a second. Denny, I'm going to mute you so it doesn't switch back and forth. Or if you could just mute yourself. There you go. How many of you have seen The Matrix? Anyone with Keanu Reeves? You know what I'm talking about? So think about the story of The Matrix. And it's this narrative you're watching play out. It looks like in the life that we're living. There's this moment where it's like, you can take a pill and you can either face the reality of what's going on or this image or this idea of what's going on. And he obviously takes the image and he wakes up in this big pod thing that's attached to this like other world that we're living in. But still, actually, and this is where it deviates from Christian Science. But there, all of a sudden, he wakes up in a reality, and it's a different type of reality that's controlled by, and he understands a world in a new light. Well, if I could encapsulate, I always thought The Matrix had great Buddhist and Christian sort of undertones and connection points. I've used it in film classes before where I highlighted these things. After studying Christian Science, The Matrix is about as close as you're going to get to understanding what they're talking about. And that is that the very world that you are living in right now is an illusion. So let that sink in. So Jeannie, give Gerald a punch on the arm. So enough that it makes it hurt. No, I'm just kidding. Pain that you feel in this world is an illusion. The break that Teresa has in her leg is an illusion. And I know I'm probably presenting it a little more humorously, but I think that there's something interesting about it, and we'll go into it and we'll talk about some of its original foundational thought, which actually is very Platonic and has very, very much to do with Christianity as well. There's a lot of overlap there, but I would say in terms of what we have studied, this is the most different worldview that we have faced. And obviously for those who have not been with us, some of these things won't make sense because I'll be making reference to them, but feel free to raise your hand or ask a question. As we normally do, I'm going to do an introduction just to some of the general concepts. We're going to dig into the history and its origins. I'll look at the main beliefs, and then I'm going to compare it to Christian theology, and then we'll go through the 8 categories of comparative religion that we've been using this whole summer, and to understand all of this. So let's start with the name, Christian Science. First of all, how many of you have ever driven by a Christian Science room? And never reading room, one of those reading rooms where you saw, no, Christian Science, no, you've never been by a Christian Science reading room? Clearly not. Well, I feel like I've encountered them my whole life, and I never, as a Christian, I never really knew what was in there. It said science, and I was like, oh, it must be like some scientific stuff in there. I just had this image of like kind of a library that you could go read Christian books, and I thought that was a weird concept, quite frankly. Well, these books, what's there contains much about Christian Science, but let me ask you this: how many of you have heard of the Christian Science Monitor? Yeah, so many of you. It is, although it has the word Christian in it, and it started as a Christian magazine. It was started by Mary Baker Eddy, who is the founder of Christian Science. Today is a 7 Pulitzer prize winning magazine that has been published since, or published earlier than this, but since 1950, it won its first award. Up to 2011, it's won 7. It's a highly reputable magazine in terms of its credibility. It is not looked as a Christian publication, although it still is founded and connected to the church, which the church actually, and I honestly, when I said we were studying Christian Science, I didn't even know what to call it. Like it was sort of, and really that's not what it's called. Christian Science is the practice of, or what you'll find actually is what they call the Holy Spirit. The religion itself, what we call Christian Science, is the term that they would use for the movement of the Holy Spirit in this world. But throughout this whole conversation, you're going to have to bend your mind around the idea that everything that you're experiencing right now is an illusion. It's as if you put on virtual reality glasses and entered into a world where but one that you physically felt pain as far as your understanding of pain and the world exists around you. Ironically, Christian Science is not very scientific in its formulation of what it believes. But the church is officially called the Church of Christ Scientists, or for some, the Christian Science Church, if you're referring to it as a entity, as a religious entity. The Christian Science Church would be probably the most accurate way. Because I think it was the Church of Christ, scientist, and so that to me, I'm not even sure how in my grammatical or just organizationally mind to frame that. But the Christian Science Church, I think, makes sense. The adherents of this religion are called Christian Scientists, or, which I think is interesting, students of Christian Science. Which I actually kind of like that. I mean, we as Christians call ourselves disciples, and disciple literally means learner. And so our sense of learning, their sense of being students. You know, you all have seen me make espresso and talk about espresso. I probably bored you to death with my espresso coffee trivia. I believe I'm a student of coffee. People are like, oh, you're a coffee snob or you're a coffee aficionado. You know, I've spent my life, but no, I mean, I feel like I'm a student, I'm constantly learning. And I think that also points to the idea that what happens in our lives in terms of what we learn is never mastered, and they would hold on to that as a value as well. Interestingly enough, they are most known as through two ways: one, the reading rooms, or two, their Christian Science the Christian Science monitor, and that's primarily the way that they're understood largely. And then, before I get into like some of the philosophical ideas that undergird them, it is interesting to me that, again, like Jehovah's Witness and Mormonism, it is considered an American religion as opposed to Christianity or yet a denomination that emerged in the UK or somewhere in Europe. Yeah.
Why did they call it science?
Because the science is a word that refers to a method. It's kind of like the idea of the science or the method or the path or the way. They'll use a lot of the way becomes in, or the road. So the science is that process through which one basically delivers oneself through silent argument is used a lot in the literature or in writing about them. Silent argument. It is an internal silent argument that you convince yourself that something is other than what it is. So in other words, not that you can heal yourself, because there really is nothing you're healing. And interestingly enough, that term healing is what, if you think of Christian Science, that is ultimately what you should think about. That word healing, it should be synonymous with it, because it captures the idea of an escape of this life, or the illusion that we live in this life and we are bound to this life in a sense of time, but only for a period. But our sickness and illness in this life are an illusion that we can overcome with right thinking. Hopefully it'll start to emerge. But here's the thing. Think about it. All these religions, whereas historically, what did I put? We'll come to that in a second. When it came out, makes total sense why this was happening. I think that there was a lot of, I don't remember when we studied peyoteism when that made it to Oklahoma, but I think there was some toad licking and some. America. It is one of the globally. It is one of the few and one of the, I believe, primary American religions that were started by a woman, and it's significant at that. And going from a very humble beginning to having a net worth, and when she died in 1910, she died at age 98. 89, with $1.5 million in her estate, which in 1910 was not obviously 1.5 million. It was probably a heck of a lot more. I don't know what the inflation rate is. Now, saying that, we'll reflect on this, and I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting. I'll just, I'm going to make jokes about it throughout. I'll probably, be somewhat pejorative on occasion, just out of humor, for humor's sake. But I think there's something interesting about it. Although I would not deny our materialism, I do think that there is much in our world that you could transfer that on a micro level and see ourselves as that we have psychological projections about lots of things in life that control the way we think and view reality. And this is the challenge that we have. We are in a state in the day and age where when we interact with the world, we do it from the lens of our own reality as opposed to from, and so there are some interesting things that fall in line with it. And by and large, they don't tweak a lot about the scriptures. They just reinterpret how the scriptures are understood. So the Bible is one of their main holy books, and then Mary Baker Eddy wrote another one. In order to understand this in general, and I've talked a little bit about this summer, the idea of Platonic thought is very critical. And in short, Platonic thought deals with that the reality, idealism is another way to put it, is that the ideas or forms, that the realities of the world that exist outside of our material world. This table is a table. Why? Why do we define it as a table? Well, you might say, well, it has 4 legs. Well, this doesn't. It actually has 2 giant legs that have 2 braces. Well, does this mean it's not a table? Okay, well, that doesn't. Maybe it's 2 things that hold up, 4 things that hold something up. But what about a 3-legged table? Is that a table? So you start getting into this debate about what is a table, and you move to the idea that a table has some concept or basis of form. And in an ideal world, or in the philosophical category of idealism, that ideal of table, or that form of table, is something that if we ascend to, then we can, in our earthly existence, can understand the essence of table. And then you extend that concept out to everything else. So in other words, the most real things are ideas or forms that exist outside, that we participate through a mental process, and then we materialize or manipulate the material world in order to express those concepts. I totally lost you. Are you following? To put it in an analogy, if you remember a philosophy class sometime you've maybe taken in life, there is the analogy of the cave, and what Plato describes is a wall like this, and there's and then there are people chained to this wall, and they can only see what's on this side of the other side of the cave. And their backs are against over here, so they can't see behind them. They're just looking ahead. And then up here, there's a light that is cast down, that is casting shadows onto this wall. And as people walk along this path and are talking, the people who are prisoners and have only known this life of imprisonment see the shadows on the wall in front of them and hear the voices and associate those shadows as having the voices. So from their perception of reality, the shadows are connected to the voices and the embodiment, so they have no concept of another human being walking up here, only these shadows of being spirits or whatever they were in the concept of the analogy, or the allegory. And the idea is that when they're unshackled and able to leave this imprisonment and leave the cave and go see that there are people and animals and wagons and other, things that are walking up there beyond that, their eyes are open to a new reality that is reality, not just their perception. The same concept undergirds everything about Christian Science, the Christian Science Church, that what we have in our world is a shadow reality of what is real. Now, there's a huge denial of materialism, and it's a huge, and not even that materialism is necessarily bad, but it is a manifestation of a fallen state. So as we talk about creation here in a second, that Mary Baker Eddy aligned herself with the creation account up to the point of Genesis 2:6, where it talks about the image in God and the likeness being given to them. And they believe at that point there's a transfer, and that somehow, and it's not really fully explained, but in the fall, in this process of those first humans becoming materialized or humanized, that they bore the image and likeness. In other words, the image and likeness are the material manifestations of God, as opposed to, and so we're living in, and there are still illusions, but they're the way we perceive the world. Okay, let's stop there before I go any farther. Questions? Does that make sense? Sort of. I'm piecing it together. Oh yeah. Christian Science, Eddie calls Mary Baker Eddy. I don't know. I keep wanting to say Mary Eddy Baker, but Mary Baker Eddy says that Christian Science was a return to primitive Christianity and to its lost element of healing. So Mary Baker Eddy looked at the way Jesus healed, looked at the movement of the Spirit, looked at the idea of it, and what we're going to reveal as we look at this day, as we look through this religion, is that Jesus becomes a moral exemplar or an example of the way we can escape. And so Jesus basically was born into, sort of broke in the same way Morpheus from the movie Matrix broke into the world, and they had those portals where they could come in and engage because they were connected to a machine. So Jesus was kind of connected to this, this outer realm, and came into the world, in our illusionary world, to show us a way out. So that when he ascended and left the earth, he went back into the realm of whatever is reality beyond this in the spirit world. Okay, still following me? Interesting. See, I know you're all like, "Hey, it sounds kooky, but it's also kind of interesting." I mean, honestly, again, this is the challenge of all of these religions that sort of came out during this time, is they're all a little kooky. But it belongs to a larger category of metaphysical family of religion, and that includes the divine science, the unity school of Christianity, the United Church of Religious Science, and they all understand the idea that life itself exists through consciousness. So the fact that you are a conscious being means that eternal life exists in you. And that's what differentiates us from the material or the animal world, is that animals don't have self-awareness in the same way that we do. It's why, dogs could have all sorts of crust around their eyes and they're like, "What? This is just me." But, but if someone has a piece of lettuce in their teeth, they're like, "Oh, you're aware of yourself. You're aware of the way you relate to another person." Whereas animals are very instinctual beings. So that sense of awareness, of consciousness, is what is life itself. And they believe, and it's a term that is still noodling around in my head, but the term God is mind, not a mind, but God is mind. God is M-I-N-D, like mind, like thinking. So God is intellect. God is this awareness, this consciousness. And we participate in that consciousness, and therefore participate in some sense in the divine, not because we have souls, but because these are what we're experiencing now, almost sort of like a giant alternative world where we're all connected to, and we are projecting our actual essence of ourself into the world. Yeah, okay. It was for some time known also as the mind cure movement, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the idea behind it is that if you can escape the entrapment and the understanding that we are not physically bound to this world, but this is a false, an illusionary world, that if you can overcome that, then your body then has the capacity to heal itself. And so it was called Mind Cure Movement. And you might say, well, that doesn't sound right. Why would people even think about that? Well, this was, and you keep in mind, this was around mid 1800s. In early medicine, they were still putting leeches on people, bloodletting, and things that we now look back and be like, that doesn't really do what we think it does. Now, saying that, I take homeopathy. I believe in the power of essential oils. In my house, if you have a headache, you put essential oil called past tense. It's a mixture of stuff in there, and it works. Same for the belly. We have one called Digest Zen, and if you have an upset stomach, you put it on. For whatever reason, it works. Is it a placebo? Is it messing with my? I have homeopathic remedies that I swear by. Arnica montana is a homeopathic remedy, and it's been around for a long time. Charles Darley, the founder of this church, in his autobiography, Pioneering the San Juans, writes about the use of Arnica montana as he visited someone along his way to come to Lake City. These are things that actually do, it's Chinese medicine. There are things that deal, and when we talked about, I think it was Yanism, the idea that the elements of the earth and all of these things fitting, and that they lead us to paths, and acupuncture, that our entire body systems, if you can stimulate the foot, that somehow, as a modern medicine, my mom was a naturopath and someone who believed in this sort of medicine. My father grew up as a Filipino and studied Chinese medicine and Asian medicine, but then came and did his internship as an anesthesiologist here. So it was this weird blend between natural or, Chinese. I grew up in a family where we didn't go to the doctor and we got a lot of orange stuff rubbed on us when we were sick. But then my father also used, I don't know if you've heard the joke that Filipinos use Vicks rub, Vicks vapor rub. Yeah, I was that child growing up where if I had even the remote hoarseness in my throat, I'd strip off my shirt and I'd get this like violent rub down on my... I did. So I don't know. I'm a product of 3 different schools of thought around medicine. But all that's to say is it came around a time of medicine in the 1850s where medicine was not developed. And so, cure-all, snake oil, these were cures or meant to. So there was some peddling of this stuff, and people were looking to relieve themselves of ailments. I remember a professor saying to me once, he was going back to the Middle Ages. He said, "We think we have ailments these days." And he said, "But you go back centuries and then you'll realize what ailments truly were." He said, "On your worst possible day that you've ever felt in your life when you've had the flu is how people lived in existence during the Dark Ages or during the Middle Ages." But anyway, all right, history. So how'd this come about? Well, to set the context, and as we've talked about in the Sunday sermons, it was 1811 that really sort of began the Restorationist movement. And for those of you who haven't been a part of that, the Restorationist movement was a time in church history where they sought to restore the church back to what first century Christianity was. So there was an attempt to study the Bible and say what was actually happening there. And again, this is a few hundred years after people are actually becoming literate. The printing press, again, came about in the 1400s. Reformation happens because people are becoming more literate, and now they can protest the church. And then as the Enlightenment came around, early 1700s to the 1750, where it was this explosion of study and academia and scholarship, and all of this sort of feeds out of that, this idea that there was a systemization of religion, and they wanted to return to what the original was. So Restorationist movement started around 1812. 1820 was Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, as we talked about, his first vision. And 1835, Charles Finley was preaching and had started his first New York City revival. So revivalism was, and this is when crazy stuff was happening in the church on this side of the pond as well. And all the way up to 1875, where we see the foundation of Christian Science, and in the same era, in the same decade, Jehovah's Witness. So all that's to say, from about the early 1800s to the late 1800s was this period of the Third and Fourth Great Awakening, of the Restorationist movements, of end time theory starting to develop, and all of this was sort of set the stage for people to say, you can kind of just invent something new, I guess. Leading up to what I say was Azusa Street in the early part of the 1900s, and again, the Pentecostal movement. But all of this was sort of meant to rediscover, and Mary Baker Eddy was a part of that. She looked at Jesus' healing powers. Jesus healed from a distance. Jesus called someone out of death. Jesus manipulated the elements of this universe, whether it be water into wine or calming of the ocean. There was a command of the illusionary world that we live in, and if you understand it in that cosmology of the illusionary world, what she's saying kind of makes sense. So I mean, I'm criticizing, I don't believe, I mean, I think there is truth here, but I don't think it's at the fullness of it. And I think, and then she missed a few things. But how it all came about, she was born in 1821, so around the time of the beginning of this period, and she ended up dying in 1910. She was from a congregational congregational church background, from the puritanical Calvinist tradition. So very much a Reformed tradition, very much piety oriented, very much stripped of musical instruments and other accoutrements that accompanied worship often from that time. And it was very staunch. And so this was a time where they were seeking something more dynamic, something more emotive, something more, and strangely enough, again, that is called science because it's not really scientifically based. But in 1866, one, she was always sickly. And honestly, to be honest, if this is actually what she looked like, my first thought was, and I hope you don't take this wrong as I say this, but it looks a little like she's inbred. She's inbred. I mean, I'm just saying. I mean, like, in other words, if you see some polygamous pictures of people who are in early Mormon colonies, there is a similar physical appearance to them. And that, when I pulled that book off the shelf, that is the first thing that came to mind. And so I don't know, and that obviously produces lots of deviation. I mean, who knows that in terms of Joseph Smith as well. All that's to say, she was sickly. She was always seeking out. She was a practitioner of all sorts of medicine. They have her recorded as from homeopathy to other things. But in 1866, she fell on ice and hurt herself pretty bad. And she discovered, in her time of recovery, had a revelatory experience that science, or the method that undergirds the truth of the universe. So again, this was a moment of revelation. And this is the challenge that we have with Mormonism. This is the challenge we have with Jehovah's Witness, and we probably would have with the myriad of other expressions of new religions that just didn't take off, that happened during this period of about 100 years or 90 years. So she had this revelatory experience, and she began. And so this is in 1866, and it's thought, although this is one of the only controversy she's ever really had around her beyond her just general beliefs, but around her actual character, is from 1862 to 1866, she was a patient of Phineas Parkhouse Quimby, who was a New England clockmaker and self-proclaimed Helist. And, in 1862 to 1865, I was reading the different dates. She was with him, and he has a method that's called mesmerism, or some places, other places it's called, where is it? Where is it? I'm gonna find it eventually. Hold on. I can't find it. It's so written down here somewhere. Something about animal. Oh, here. Animal magnetism. It's called animal magnetism or mesmerism. No, it's not. That's what I thought at first. But it's almost like self-hypnotism a little bit, but I don't think it really is, because it's not dealing with the hypnotism deals with the reorganization of the subconscious, and it's not really, it's more about a conscious awareness. But animal magnetism, which sounds like you're magnetically drawn to animals, but the idea is there's something in the fluid in the blood or in the body, that the idea that this contains some entity that allows you to actually influence others negatively through thoughts. So this is the basis that would undergird voodooism. And now here's where I want to pause and say, this is where I think it dips a little bit into reality, and as a former Pentecostal, creeps me out a little bit, and I want to always give respect to the spirit world. But someone in town who I know and I trust and respect their testimony talked and shared about a story of him being in a large crowd where this sort of healing power, or this power of positive thought, was demonstrated. And what he was have to do is he went in and they did that arm thing where you lift up your arms and you can't lift up your arms. And you know, most people see that, they're like, oh, they're faking it. Someone's, well, you know, the woman did this thing where she kind of tested, or I think it was a woman that tested his power to lift up his arms, and then he left, and then she said to the crowd, I can hold him at a certain point, but now, and that was me putting on this consistent pressure and holding him. And she said, I want you to think very positive thoughts. Or maybe it was negative first, I don't remember which order. But everyone in the crowd thought, you know, just imagine yourself having auras of energy and sending this energy and give positive thoughts and strength and good stuff. And so he comes out and he lifts, and it just has no problem pushing through her. And then the reverse happens, goes out, and she talks about the negativity and the negative. And I think this is where animal magnetism comes in, that you're spreading this energy of negativity, and he came out, and then all of a sudden he's unable to lift his arms beyond this, you know, she's able to push him down. Now, is she manipulating this? I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there, I couldn't experience it, but I know the person I talked to, who was the person who was experiencing this, said in their encounter of this, they were like blown away. Like, why is this happening? Why am I feeling that? Is it just her resistance? He didn't feel it was. All that's to say is, I do, you know, I have a respect enough for the spirit world to say that there are things that go on, there are energies, there are lights that we don't understand. When we look at the stories, and we as Christians, as people of faith, if we look at the stories of Jesus' healing, we have to acknowledge that this is a part of the cosmology that we believe in. That Jesus had the capacity to take water, and just through what, with those of us who were with us in our conversation about celestial beings last year, would say that there are celestial beings that are in charge of the elements of the universe, including this water. And on Jesus's command, he wasn't actually doing it out of power of his own, although it's all God's power. He was commanding those celestial beings who control those elements to, in the case of water to wine, completely morph something, or to multiply something in the case of the loaves and the fishes, or to command the sea, or to reverse the element of gravity within water as Peter walks on the water. Like, if we as Christians hold the Bible as true, and we hold those stories as evident to something real, then these things, the manipulation of the material world that we live in is possible. Mary Baker Eddy would say it's easy to do when it's an illusion. But for those of us who believe this is actual material world, then we have to have a structure for how that works. So you don't have to, but it's interesting to have one. I wish I had the power to change that into wine. In 1875, she writes a book called Science and Health, and it is basically a way to understand healing through understand. It's her concepts, or her understanding of her cosmology, of the way that fits into the Bible, and then republishes it in 1883 as The Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And in 2001, over 9 million copies of this has been sold to date. With the Bible and this Health and Science with the Key to Scriptures are considered their two canonical books, or inspired books, and she does see them as further revelation that she's been given. In 1879, they chartered it as a official Christian denomination in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, and by 1882, only 3 years later, they were sanctioned as an official church called the Church of Christ Scientist. By 1881, or the year before, 1881, she established the Massachusetts Metaphysical College, and then about a decade later, in 1894, they established the first Church of Christ Scientist in Boston. And if you do think of it later, to just go home and search for First Church of Christ Scientist, it's this cool little triangle building that sits on the edge, and that was the original sort of structure, and then this gigantic dome that sits behind it, which was the add-on later. But it's pretty impressive, kind of like the Mormon temples were impressive. And after that, in 1894, it was until for probably almost 30 years, 40 years, maybe, yeah, about 40 years, from 1994 probably to about the early 1930s, which was considered the height of their tradition or religion or whatever you want to call it. It was the fastest growing church in America. And where is it here? In 1895, a year after they built that church in Boston, she wrote the manual of the mother church, which was their government. And this is in, again, 1895. And at that time, they wrote in it that they would no longer publish member stats. So if you go to look up stats today, you'll find that we can count churches. There are currently approximately 1,750 Christian Science churches worldwide, and there are 900 counted in the US, but their membership is thought to be somewhere between 400,000 and less than 100,000. Somewhere between less than 100,000 to 400,000. I should have done that that way. Sorry, I wrote it backwards on my notes. All that's to say is they don't really want people to know how many there are. So we don't, of all of these religions that we've been counting all summer, we've been talking about, rough adherence censuses, and obviously those are always off because you always have unreported. We'll have 600 hikers. People, summer. The truth is, we'll probably have a lot more than that came through because you don't count everybody. But if you're ever interested, and this is going to shock you, I'm about to go through. I picked names that I knew, and there probably were a lot more. But if you want to look at today, the members that belong or who have been raised in the Christian Science Church are Marilyn Monroe, Ernest Hemingway, Jim Henson, the puppeteer, Robin Williams, Henry Fonda, Elizabeth Taylor, the designer, Keith Green, the popular Christian artist, Ellen DeGeneres, Val Kilmer, J.D. Salinger, what does that say? Danielle Steele, Carol Channing, Doris Day, Kelsey Grammer, Ginger Rogers, they are all students of the Christian Science. And there was a whole list, and there were more. I just wrote down, and then I ran out of room, so I stopped writing them down. But I tried to get a smattering of various. She died in 1910. Again, I said earlier, as an 89-year-old with a $1.5 million estate, which most of it went actually to the church itself. They think that in 1936, that was the height, and they estimated the population or the attendees or the adherents as 268,915 members, and that was in the. What was I saying? I don't know. Oh, that's something else. And so the idea is that we don't know how big they are, but they do still exist. Obviously, the reading rooms, and the Christian Science Monitor is obviously still has its presence in culture. In 2011, one of their ranking officials, and I paraphrase this because it was too long, but this comes to the idea of healing. He says, all healing is a metaphysical process. And again, for those that are not familiar with the prefix meta, it usually means overarching, something larger. So it's above the physical world. So it really, even metaphysical is a insufficient word to describe the illusionary basis, because there is a metaphysical world that we could describe as the non-material world or the spiritual world, which they would kind of dip into, but because we believe in more of a dualistic cosmology, that there is another realm and we live in one, they don't believe there's another realm. There's only one realm and the projection of another realm. But all healing is a metaphysical process. There is no person to be healed because you're not real. There is no material body, no patient, no matter, no illness, no one to heal, no substance, no person, no thing, no place, and I don't know what that says. Must be something. Oh, you must have clarity, and you escape by having clarity of what the reality of the world is. And they believe this can happen by mental assent. And if you go to a Christian Scientist today, they will actually walk you through a method or a process for very inexpensively to somewhat overcome, to the extent that I'm actually almost tempted to go take a session just to see what they do. But to walk you through this process, to say, to help you understand and to come to the realization that this is an illusion. Okay, some interesting beliefs. It's considered to be a radical philosophical, it's in the category of radical philosophical idealism, which I've said which is the idea that reality is 100% spiritual, and that we live in a dream world of nothingness. That there are, everything that we believe exists are mere mental projections, and that the material world is entirely an illusion. Therefore, and by that virtue, when they encounter the notion of disease, which is ultimately what it sought to really address, is disease is a mental state or a mental era, not an actual physical disorder that you're treating. And that's not to say that in our illusionary world that we haven't developed means or methods to treat these ailments and that they aren't successful in treating them, but even that process within the illusionary world that we live in, those are not actual things. They're kind of like fake solutions to fake problems. So the sick can be healed by prayers, and that's not a sort of God heal me, but a mental awareness through prayer toward correct thinking. They do actually participate, and there's no stipulations about what you can or cannot participate within medical conventions. So they actually still go to the doctor. They still do all these things almost as a self-care in this illusionary world, but with the acknowledgement that it's not real. So it's almost like a subordinate understanding in order to alleviate the illusionary pain because it's still experienced as real pain. And in my gamer mind, I like to say this is what they talk when they talk about board games. People who don't like to play board games because when they lose, their brains can't tell the difference between a game that they're playing and an actual real life loss, and they actually go through the trauma of real life loss over a game, which I never understood as I'm not very competitive until I played this root tournament this past winter, and I went back and I lost my last tournament that eliminated me from the tournament, or my game that eliminated me from the tournament, and for weeks I obsessed over this like these few moves that I did in this game, and I thought if I had just done that differently, and I couldn't let it go, and so there was a constant sort of haunting, and so then my wife Shannon was like, well, that's what happens every time I play a game. And I'm like, I wouldn't want to play games either if that's what it would be. So she lies at night thinking, why didn't I do that differently? Yeah.
They pay for the dentist when you go because it's an illusion.
Yeah, they still pay with an illusion. But it changes the way you think about the world you live in if you think of it as illusion. But interestingly enough, they do use modern medicine, but from 1880 to 1990, there are several landmark cases that deal with parental abuse and neglect around parents not doing something for their child when procedures were available to them, and they're trying to get their child to realize. Now, and this is the way they compensate for that is that in the case of a parent, you could still you could relieve their mental anguish or their illusionary anguish by this illusionary means, because it brings them to a state of peace or stability, so that they maybe can explore or find a place of enlightenment. And they don't even really use the word enlightenment, so I probably shouldn't use that because I don't want to mix it up with other perspectives. Ideas are considered extensions of God or of the divine mind, but are mental projections that we create to clothe our ideas. So the ideas themselves are real, but the things that we call material world are mental projections we do to put around the concept. So the concept of table is real. This is our mental projection of it. This is the clothing of that table that we put in our illusionary world to understand it and manifest itself in something that we perceive as being material in front of us. They believe the dream world that we live in is a result of the fall, and that Jesus essentially broke into our dream world to show us the way out of it. and to alleviate our pain in it through this sense of awareness or consciousness, that we have the capacity to repair what is in our world through. Basically, it's kind of like the idea that if you become aware of the reality, you can control the condition you're in. So what we perceive as being deterministic or luck or or evil or sickness, these are all things that we mentally, cognitively have the capacity to change into, and so, I mean, if it was true, if I thought that was true, maybe it is true, I don't know, I mean, I don't think it is, but if it was, then you could control all sorts of things. They don't, when they talk about healing, they don't, it's important that we don't think of it in terms of faith healing, that you're not praying to a God to do something in you. You're not praying to Christ to intercede for you, to heal your loved one or to heal yourself. Those are concepts of an exchange. I'm asking and bequesting something of a divine being to do something for me, as opposed to their healing is more understood as realization. When you realize the truth, then you have the capacity to heal yourself. So it's not quite heal yourself, but it is heal your illusionary self by the understanding of this other world. And in that light, it makes the atonement, Christ came, and we'll talk about a little bit. I guess I'll stick it here, but just the categories that we looked at each week, the 8 categories of world religions. The idea of celebrating festivals or holy days, they don't celebrate most things because they're illusionary, so I celebrate them. But they do celebrate Christmas, they do celebrate Good Friday, and they do celebrate Easter, but they don't do it in the same way we do it, and they place way greater emphasis on Christmas, not because they believe it is the exact date of Jesus' birth, but they believe that Jesus was the ultimate moral exemplar that showed us the way out, so they're commemorating this idea of the inbreaking of this world, that someone who didn't have to be in this world of delusionary or illusionary world that we live in came in to reveal, kind of like Morpheus did to Neo. When Samuel L. Jackson's character comes in, Samuel L. Jackson? Mm-hmm. Yeah, comes in and is talking No, it wasn't Sam. What's that guy's name? Lawrence Fishburne. Yes. When Lawrence Fishburne comes in and does that, he is giving in the illusionary world, Neo, Keanu Reeves, a chance to remain in the illusionary world and deal with the challenges of that, or to break free from that. And that's essentially what Christ did. You want a blue pill? And so when we come to faith, when we come to light, and ultimately when we come to the realization of what Christ actually did, which was show us the way to overcome. And when you look at his life and his miracles and everything he did, there's some sense of manipulation of this world and this realization, this process he goes through. But then his atonement, the question is, why does that make a sense? Because it actually wasn't really truly death, because it was just a death within the world, is meant to be an exemplification of our unity with God. It is a portrait of the death of flesh, the denial of self, the ridding of the material world, and then being reborn in a new state where he could then go transfer from the illusionary world to the real world. Okay. And last, what Mary Baker Eddy in the 1881 edition of one of the books, she wrote 46 pages in a chapter called Animal Magnetism Unmasked, and the idea that we can project negativity on someone else and influence them with what we would call evil, they would just call, negativity or darkness, or that those are able to be influenced. And she believed, and then it was originally edited down to 7 pages in the 1888 edition by someone else. But she believes that's what in 1882 killed her husband, that there were people who were working against her and basically sent evil spirits to go. But here's the thing. Have you ever heard of Reiki? Reiki, the healing thing? They move energy. So when I did a clinical pastoral education thing, we had to, I was exposed to Reiki, and I'd heard of Reiki, but I was exposed to practitioners of Reiki, and they'll lay you out on a platform, and the idea is that you're moving energy. So it's an acknowledgement of the real force and, power and force of energy, and that there can be blocks in this energy force, and that's what's holding sickness in certain parts of your body, or pain in certain parts of your body, and they can actually disperse this negative energy through your body or remove it entirely. And it's based loosely on the principle that when Jesus sent power to heal the centurion's daughter, or commanded, Lazarus, like he was sending, it didn't require a touch. He felt energy when someone touched his cloak. The woman with the issue of blood touched his cloak. Energy came out of him. It's the idea, the real idea. I mean, and honestly, I buy a little bit into this. Some of you have heard my theory on, Ananias and Sapphira, why Peter smote them just because they held a little bit back from the church. I'm sure they weren't the only people cheating the church. But I believe in that instance, or my loose theory around it is that this was right after Pentecost. The power of the Spirit in a real way was present with Peter, just like origin stories of superheroes, and they don't really quite know their power. And if you've ever seen an X-Men movie, the guy who takes off his glasses and his beams are shooting up everywhere and destroying buildings. Peter didn't quite have grasp of the power of the Holy Spirit, and it came out manifested in a spirit of anger or something negative, and it actually overpowered Ananias and Sapphira and killed him. Otherwise, it's a really screwed up story where it seems like just because you lie to an apostle, you're going to face death. And I can't believe that they're the only ones who held back some of their belongings from the church as they were figuring out what the church was going to be. So that's my explanation of Ananias and Sapphira. But all that's to say that there's a real sense of power, and Reiki works on that idea that you can move power, that you can move energy, that you can project light. And honestly, we still hold on to this in some true sense of it. I mean, the passing of the peace is what we do. I don't know what everyone's tradition is, but if you've ever been, we do it in our church here, the passing of the peace. And I don't put too much emphasis on it too when we have a huge crowd, because we're not there, I think, as a community. But the reality is that if I had my druthers and could shape the passing of the peace, it would actually be some sense of physical belief that when you embrace someone of a believer in Christ, someone who contains a metaphysical sense of peace about them, that when you embrace someone, you can physically transfer peace to one another. And you can feel this. I think it's what happens I think it's tied to our emotions. It's if you've had a rough day and someone holds you and you feel a sense of peace and calm. It's when you need a release and someone holds you and you start to bawl and cry. It's when you can hug someone and they're so excited and you can feel their joy. We might say that's empathetic. We might say that's sympathetic. We might say it's pheromones, hormones. I mean, you could put a lot of labels on it. I don't really know how exactly to describe it or to define it, but I know that there are times where those things are experienced as true, and they're an expression of our world. Okay, well, let's do a comparison of their theology, and then we'll look at those 8 categories, but I've touched on many of them. Any questions before I go on?
What about hell?
Oh, I'm going to get to that right now. Yeah.
I just don't see their purpose
Of what?
of worship. I mean, how do they?
There isn't this. I mean, why would they worship?
No, I mean, if they don't believe this is real, why are they participating?
Because it is, and this is where it dips in a little bit into the Buddhist ideals. It's an escape of the, Buddhism again is that cyclical reincarnation cycle where you're eventually trying to escape. I don't remember all of them, but a number of the religions, it's not just continually forever going up and down the spiral of good and bad. The goal is to become a human and then become an enlightened human, which is a Buddha. Remember, Buddha is not a person. Buddha is a state of enlightenment. And when you become a Buddha, then you're relieved from that endless cycle. Well, in that regard, I don't know why I'm doing. I think with pencils in my hands, so sometimes but no, I mean, it's there. There's a sense of escape of pain. And so escape of the entrapment of as well. And as we look at it, well, let's just go here. Because when you understand the fall, how they understand it, that we're in this state of fallenness, and that fallenness is the illusion. So God, their doctrine of God is non-Trinitarian. They believe the Christian doctrine of God actually is polytheism, and they don't agree with that. And you know, I went down that path myself. We say that we're monotheistic, but we have sort of just found a nice little midway between monotheism and polytheism. There's three, but they're one. Well, if there's three, that's polytheism. That's anything more than one is poly. But we call it monotheism. But they're non-Trinitarian. They believe in one divine God, who they call the divine mind, truth, Father, Mother, the principle, love, life. They do not believe God in any way, shape, or form has any sort of personhood. They use the term all in all quite a bit as well. They believe Jesus Christ was almost he was the moral exemplar, and we believe in Christianity that there is an acceptable view of the atonement. Moral exemplar is someone who's come to show us the way. They call him a Christian scientist, the way shower, the first to manifest the truth. Jesus, and they actually, when they talk about, they'll call him the Christ in terms of his deity, or Jesus in terms of his humanity, because Jesus was the man and Christ was truth. So Jesus Christ is how they reconcile Jesus being all divine and all human, or but even in this world, it's a projection still, nonetheless. The Holy Spirit is Christian Science. This revelation. If you come to a place, in the same way we would say that the Spirit reveals God or the authority of the Scriptures to us, as our advocate, as our guide, as our discerner, that Christian Science as a concept or an idea or philosophy or a theology is the Spirit working in the individual, and as you embrace Christian Science, you are embracing the Spirit that is guiding that process, which I think is kind of fascinating. They believe creation, like I said, up to everything is good and peachy keen up to the development of the world. It really doesn't make a difference in their schema, but that there was some sense of a world up to 2:6, where it says, and then they believe then from 2:6, Genesis 2:6 on, that is a story of becomes in the fall becomes a story of the false and the material. So there's a materialization, and they're not pinpointing it, but as those of you who have heard my own cosmology, and I know some of you haven't, is and again, this is Jason speaking, I like to toy around with this stuff, but the idea I sort of loosely hold, and I really do mean loosely hold, because it's just an idea, that Adam and Eve in their original form were not like the physical beings that we are subhuman, we are different than the reality. And part of that is an interpretational choice that says when God infleshed, or God clothed them with skins of animals, right? You know the verse? And we often assume that's because they realized they were naked, they wanted to cover up their private parts, and God was like, oh, you're so modest, let me give you some buffalo skin to cover up, like, really? Like for me, that sense of the realization, the shame, the nakedness was the enfleshment. And the story of that is when it says God clothed them, it was the realization that of the world that they're around. It was an experience. And when it says God clothed them with skins of animals, I ponder, did God actually clothe them and enflesh them, incarnate them with the skins of the animal world? But they believe and they call the first cause, the creator, the first cause of it all is mind or cognition. Humanity is an idea of the mind. It is a human is a distorted view of itself. It is a projection of the actual self. So it's a distortion, a manipulation. Which, if I knew that, I think I would have made myself a better athlete growing up. I didn't know I had control over that, but so as a consequence, because they see it as an illusion, many do not have funerals. They view death as a departure of the illusionary world, and and then that the funeral is not necessary because it's an illusion. Sin and death are understood as they don't believe in the existence of evil. They believe in evil thought as a illusion, anything that is an illusion that draws you from your pure self or your true self. And they don't believe in that you can communicate with the dead beyond this world, because that's what makes Jesus's interaction with this world so unique, because he transcended, as opposed to we don't have access to those outside of this illusionary world. Their afterlife, they have no doctrine of the soul. You're a mental state. It's an intellect. And in the same way, it dips a little bit into Mormonism in that regard. And they don't believe in heaven or hell, because those are concepts or states of our mind that we have put into play to relieve us of the idea of the pain or gear us towards the pleasure of escaping death. Briefly, real quick, I think we're on time. Like I said, they don't believe in prayer for others, so they don't do it. Most of their prayer exists as a practice of silent argument against the material world. They don't believe actually in sacrifice, because everything is ritual, and there are no rituals, because those are all made up of part of the illusionary world. So although Christ's atonement and freedom of this world through death and the crucifixion of the cross is an example in part of how you rid oneself, he escaped the world by death, but through the enlightenment, through the understanding of living a life unaffected by evil thoughts. They don't have the sacrament of baptism. They do go to church. They do have a place where you can go, and usually it's reading, but it's not really in the same way. They don't have clergy. There's no pastors or anything like that. There is no bread and wine. The remembering the sacraments was meant to be just a mental remembering. So they don't even consume, but they do gather together twice a year on Sundays. And they unite with Christ through silence and on bended knee. So it's a very meditative service twice a year, where they believe they find union with Christ, who is beyond this universe, through this. So they do have that ritual, but they don't have many throughout that time. These are categories, for those of you who have been with us, that we've dealt with. So experience or practices, sacrifice, sacrament, space. Space is an illusion, and there is no space outside of our illusion. Time is an illusion. Eternity is the reality. The word, I said, their sacred word is the Bible, which they believe is God revealed and part of that revelation. But they understand that through the health and science publication. Both are considered inspired texts, and there are those that believe that her writing of the health and science publication is actually the second coming of Christ in some form of word to help guide. Like I said, festivals, they celebrate Christmas as they believe it is the coming of the truth, and they commemorate Good Friday, and they also commemorate Easter as a ridding of this life, or as an example of how we separate ourselves from this life. And their concept of myth is robust, because everything is an illusion or a myth of the mind. So they live in a state where they legitimately believe they live in some sort of illusionary world. So just pause for a moment and imagine if this was the realization that this world doesn't exist and this is an illusion. And that's Christian Science.
Where do they say you go when you die?
You don't go anywhere, because it's an illusion. You don't go anywhere when you die.
So there's no existence when you die?
Your existence is in some mental state, and it's not even a soul, it's a consciousness that's absorbed into the mind, the divine mind.
Why is that not heaven?
I mean, it's comparable. I mean, it would be more of an abstract view of heaven, but it wouldn't, I mean, it's not a place. I mean, we believe that there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth that's similarly to what we live in now, but it's just redeemed and without death and decay.
So what do they think happens to people who don't have that awareness that they aspire to?
Non-existence. So
it pretty much comes down to the individual having to save himself.
yes, individual having to save himself through realization. And the other thing I would say is, in all our reading of this, In all the other religions, there seemed to be this emphasis on peace and loving your neighbor and harmony and dealing with the realities of this world through sometimes spiritual, sometimes physical, I mean, all sorts of ways of ascent, sometimes, disciplinary, sometimes ascetic. But all of them deal with the world as an actual place. This is the only religion that we've looked at that doesn't view what we are experiencing right now as reality. Or is an illusion.
Can you hear me?
Is
No.
a collective illusion of our consciousness, of the divine consciousness that we participate in.
Would it be of a dimension?
Interesting though, eh? Danny, I see you coming on, Danny. Do you have a question? Let me turn you up.
Would you consider it like a dimension where they think things in dimension? Like,
No, I wouldn't.
No?
Because the dimension acknowledges that dimensions exist because there's an acknowledgement that the dimension you're in is different and coexist existential as the other dimension. And the illusion is more like the Matrix, where it doesn't act, this isn't real. Which to me, I don't know how that doesn't lead to anarchy, because it's like, well, let's just try a few things out then.
What is the allure of this religion? It's obviously very unorthodox. It would not resonate with anybody in the 1800s or 1900s today in this country, I don't think.
Well,
why would I want to become a scientist?
yes. So the question for those online, what is the allure? Why would I want to become a Christian Science? I think that there is the promise of, if what they were saying is true, then cancer would not be an issue.
It's a way to sort of.
It's a way to deal with
the pain I have in my life.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way to reframe the pain and misery and condition that we find ourselves in, because it's not real.
And is there this promise of healing yourself, like you sort of alluded to as well? Would that maybe appeal to me? Like,
I think
if I had the right mindset, that I could heal myself.
Every religion, I mean, there are some in every religion that will claim we have the truth,
Right. Yeah.
and there's a sense of pride. We know what's going on. We're on the inside. This is, we understand the way things really are, and what is not real is, you can dismiss, and it becomes not, it's.
How do they have relationships now?
Well,
Are they
yeah.
real, or are relationships just sort of a thing you have to go through life? I mean, like, it seems like if most of this is not real, then nothing would matter.
So let me put it in a different realm many of us, some of us are connected to online communities. There are real people behind those usernames and those avatars, but they're not real people to us. We never met them. We've never ate with them. We've never touched them, never shaken their hands. And so there is an existence of that, and then you can have that, and so you still foster that relationship, although it's not a relationship in front of you. Not that it's not real, but it's not tangible, but it is still the world you live in. And so you live in this sort of internet world, and you still exist in that, and you still have meaningful things in that, although you may never meet any of these people. And so I think in the same way, the acknowledgement of you're still stuck in this life, it's an illusion or not, just because it's an illusion, you can go off and be a monk and sit on a mountain and do nothing, but there's still life to be had. And now if you have this new enlightenment, this new consciousness that allows you to control the world you live in and control your own health and all these sort of things, well, that's pretty cool. I mean, if that was actually true, or if I thought that was true, or if I found this realization, I would think I would be, why not? If I can control my health and have nothing but happiness in this world, why exist in it? And then what I've done is ultimately follow Christ to the cross, denying this existence and experiencing my true existence in eternity. Glenda.
How does psychology say about this? Because this sounds very like
Delusional?
people are diagnosed with
I don't know what modern science.
disorders and things.
Jason,
Hold on a second, Danny. Yeah, no, I didn't read a lot of criticisms of it just in this, and I haven't for most of these. I have not read the criticisms of them. I tried to embrace the actual religion from the religion itself. So I don't know what modern, I mean, I would imagine that most traditional cognitive sciences would look at them as being delusional. So, but here, let's go to Denny and then I'll go back to Jim. Denny?
Yes, didn't the puppeteer Henson die because of his denial of all this? Isn't that how he died? Remember the
I don't know.
puppeteer?
Is it true? I don't have any idea. Maybe
He,
that's why.
he rejected medicine.
Oh, well, that makes sense. I mean, so did and here's the Jehovah's Witness did the same thing, but for different reasons. But that's actually interesting, just so you say that. You had Jim Henson, who saw himself living in an illusionary world, who played with puppets and created an illusionary world. No, but seriously, think about that. If that is his mindset, and he has literally created a world that exists unto itself, that for some children, like this was this whole world that he constructed for them, that it was illusionary. Maybe he did that out of his own belief system. Yeah, Jim.
Isn't this the fallacy of religion? Because you can't control your reality. And so no matter what you do, you can't control it. Can you? I mean, that's the.
I mean, to some extent, you can control reality.
Some, but then life comes at you, and you can't control all the different things that happen in your life.
No, I mean, to some extent, we still have agency. I mean, if you and I started wrestling,
I'd lose.
I mean, well, that's a given. But I mean, but you can't control that situation. If I want to come over there and wrestle with you right now, I mean, you either have to wrestle or lie there like a lump.
I was a state champ.
I don't know. But you can't control that, but I can. So, I mean, in other words, we do have agency. And I think even in this illusionary world, there's agency. I would highly encourage you all to go watch them. I haven't even, as I was studying this afternoon, I thought, I want to watch The Matrix now. Maybe next week we should do that after this class. Yeah, Chrissy.
It's been really successful somehow because their big temple, and the first thing is it's close to where my daughter lives in Boston.
Yeah.
It's a big chunk of really expensive real
Oh,
estate.
it's amazing. It's a beautiful building.
They have some sort of money because it is a large area.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful. It has this big reflecting pool
Yeah.
and stuff.
Do they
It's like
fly?
blocks long.
I didn't research that.
You know.
If you want to read more. So, other questions? Go for it.
I'm struggling with, the Christian scientists don't believe that man has a soul. Is that correct?
Not in the soul in the way the Western mindset would conceptualize it. That would, we would say that there's the essence of humanity as a soul, and that soul has eternal existence and is reunited with its maker, because we still confess that souls are created, but that we are counted among souls, that we're reunited with our maker, that we are rid of our material body. They don't have that concept of an individuality of a soul, that the mind consciousness is, I guess, subsumed into the larger consciousness.
So when a person dies, what goes from this facade of a reality into the true reality?
Well, nothing, because your mind is not in this reality. It is a projection of your mind. It just the illusion ends. So in other words, if you have virtual reality, so virtual reality glasses, you got them on, you got or better yet, there was something called Second Life that came out. I don't know if you remember this. You create an avatar and you can go. In fact, there was actually a Presbyterian church. I went to seminary with a seminarian who started the first Presbyterian church of Second Life. Is that what it was called? And they had worship. And actually he got a grant to fund the church, to pay for and there were Christians from all over the country, world maybe, who were meeting with these avatars in this world on their screen. And one of the big questions that came up was the notion of embodiment. And it really was an interesting discussion because we begin these relationships with people online or connection with people online or online church where we can have conversation, we have connection on these things, but it lacks physical embodiment. In particular, that becomes a problem when we start dealing with the Eucharist, the communion and baptism. And I remember asking him, his name is Neil Locke, and he was named after a Locke from, what's the guy's name in Locke in scripture? Or I mean, in history. Anyway, but he created this church online and people embodied it. But just because it was there doesn't mean that their mind or their consciousness were existing in this material world. They were just aware of it, that it existed. So when that fake world ended, it wasn't as if they had to retract anything. Couldn't make, John Locke, there you go. Oh yeah, it was from Lost. It was John Locke, yeah. He was named after. And for those of you who don't know, Calvin and Hobbes, they're named after John Calvin and Thomas Hobbes. And if you actually read this comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes, through the lens of Calvinism, it's like watching a movie, and knowing the end. It's like watching Fight Club and knowing what's going on. If you've never seen Fight Club, you probably don't want to. Betty, have you seen Fight Club? Also another great psychological film. But other questions? We should do a film series next summer. Maybe that's what we should do for pubs. Any other questions? All right. Well, that's all I have tonight, folks. So I'll stop this and